Now, it seems only fitting that a conference of this nature would begin with a panel entitled Byzantine Subjectivity and Modernity, one that brings to the forefront both the subject of Byzantium as envisioned by modernity and the subject of modernity as envisioned through Byzantium. It is this dual positioning, this chiasmic turning back and looking at one another that our two following speakers bring us into the question, bring us into the questions set forth by this conference. Our first speaker is Stratis Papaioannou, Associate Professor of Classics and Director of the Modern Greek Studies program at Brown University. Professor Papaioannou studied Greek literature at the University of Athens in Greece and Byzantine literature and culture at the University of Vienna, where he earned his doctorate in 2000. Before joining Brown's Department of Classics in January 2006, Professor Papaioannou taught post-classical Greek at the Catholic University of America. He has received research fellowships from Dumbarton Oaks, the Center for Advanced Study at the Norwegian Academy of Science and Letters in Oslo, and the Humboldt Foundation at the Freie Universität in Berlin. Professor Papaioannou has published extensively in a variety of languages. Some of his recent articles include Byzantine Energeia and Theories of Representation, and Michael Psellos' Rhetorical Gender. His forthcoming book is entitled Michael Psellos, Rhetoric and Authorship in Byzantium, to be published by Cambridge University Press. And he has an additional forthcoming volume entitled Michael Psellos on Literature and Art, co-edited with Charles Barber. His paper today is titled The History of Autobiography and Byzantine Literature. Please help me in welcoming Professor Stratis Papaioannou.
Well, thank you, Roland, for the introduction and the invitation to participate. Since my topic is autobiography, I think it's proper to begin with a confession, because I must confess that, though flattered, I'm a bit puzzled by the fact that I'm the first to speak in this conference, and especially in the first panel of illustrious speakers. Yet, like a good Byzantine, I'm just accept my place in the prescribed order of things, the prescribed taxis, hoping that there is some kind of divine reason behind it. The modern fate of Byzantine autobiography maybe I can see. Maybe a little more light. Yeah, I can. Is there a light here? Okay. All right, that's better. So, the modern fate of Byzantine autobiography, the expression as well as creation, that is, of discursive subjectivity in medieval Greek writing, for which I would like to make a case today, is connected with the trajectory of the culture we have come to call Byzantium in Western European historical consciousness. This consciousness had increasingly little space for Byzantium, caught as it was in models of universal history that privileged the Western European insider. The historiographical tradition that addressed this insider, to borrow a scheme recently explored by Antonis Liakos, mixed narratives of decline that followed a linear teleological time frame with narratives of revival, cyclical time, and utopian progress. The former saw the Roman Empire in its medieval continuations as the last and inferior stage of a declining humanity, only to be saved by the imminent divine retribution. The scheme is nicely visualized here in this late 18th century etching engraved by Tobias Conrad Lothar, most famous for his cartographic work. And I'll show you three examples here. The Colossus Monarchicus represents the statue from the book of Daniel and the sequence in decline of the various universal monarchies. Byzantium occupies the bottom right leg. The imminent rock of the unending divine kingdom is on the upper right of the picture. The narrative of revival and progress promoted a different image. Here, visualized in another engraving designed by Rubens and used for a book on Greco-Roman antiquity published in 1645. Time and death on the upper right, throw the empires of Rome, Macedonia, and Persia into the abyss, from which Mercury revives proper Greco-Roman antiquity in the form of statues and a slave that delivers coins. In this image that breathes a self-confident renaissance of glorious antiquity, Byzantium is entirely absent, as it is part of that medieval version of the Roman world that is tramped upon and rejected into darkness. Of course, it is true that at a closer look, Byzantium, after the sack of Constantinople in 1204 by the Crusaders, had a variety of trajectories within the consciousness of European modernity, to which I cannot do justice here. Nevertheless, the sedimented views of history that I just described demanded that, largely speaking, Byzantium, especially because it is essentially a culture without a modern air, a modern national air, that is, would remain a marginal word, incongruous to the cultural mainstream. There have been some exceptions to this, and parts of European modernism to which this conference is devoted is a case in point. But even in these exceptions, that what usually is appropriated is a Byzantium that remains somewhat speechless, without signature, abbreviated to a visual vocabulary reconstructed by elements of mosaics, the icon painting, and church architecture. The modern fate of the Byzantine discursive tradition, the other half of the Byzantine world of representation, accentuates even further the marginality of Byzantium. Never reclaimed as a national literature, except from its meager vernacular production, Byzantine literature remains a phantom in the modern world. This is a literature with no canon. We would be hard-pressed to identify, say, a top 10 of Byzantine literature. And don't worry, there will be no quiz. More importantly, this is a literature with no modern community of readers to whom it matters, with the exception perhaps of Greek Orthodox churchgoers who are exposed to some Byzantine texts, though again this is an abbreviated Byzantium. Unsurprisingly, the modernist literary, not visual art, in modernist literary, not visual art, Byzantine literature is rarely, if ever, referenced. And my impression is that the few references that do exist echo faintly some of the principal ways in which Byzantium is rediscovered in modernism, as an expression of perhaps exotic or decadent, but also appealing formal otherness, and as a substitute for a hidden nostalgia for religious ritual. A tool, in other words, for modernism's ostensive break from tradition and modernism's uncanny yielding to quasi-religious enchantment. Here is, for example, a poem in the aftermath, but still the tradition of modernism, that reflects but also refracts this stereotypical approach to the Byzantine discursive art of representation. While the empire went to pot, he amused himself, extemporizing highly moral iambics, deficient in rhythm. This poem that caricatures a Byzantine poet, and which is followed by another brief poem in Auden's Marginalia, that cites by name Michael Psellos, the 11th century Constantinopolitan author to whom I will return also below. Modernism has brought little change here. Auden, who wrote this poem in the 1960s, and echoes and at the same time reduces a sentiment already present in, for example, Cavafis, a Byzantine nobleman in exile composing verses, or a poem written almost 100 years earlier during the heart of the symbolist movement by Paul Verlaine, his Langueur. I am the empire at the end of the decadence, composing lazy, indolent acrostic poems in a gilded style in which the languor of the sun dances. There is certainly more to discover in the unwritten history of the peculiar pleasance of the Byzantine literary tradition in the literary world of modernity. My concern, however, lies elsewhere. Against the backdrop of these introductory observations, I would like to do two things. First, explore the European reception of a particular aspect of Byzantine literature, namely discourse in the first person singular, and then offer glimpses of an alternative history of Byzantine discursive subjectivity. If one were to open any recent volume on the history of theories, as well as discursive practices of subjectivity, and there are several such books, one would be hard-pressed to discover any reference to Byzantium and Byzantine authors. In this respect, the historiography of subjectivity, literary subjectivity especially, has changed little since Enlightenment. From its perspective, Byzantium is and remains a world of the impersonal, a world without sovereign individual subjects. In this dominant view, the Byzantine self works like the Byzantine artists in the orientalizing gaze of Yeats, for example. The painter, the mosaic worker, the worker in gold and silver, the illuminator of sacred books were almost impersonal, almost without the consciousness of individual design. Yeats wrote in his autobiographical A Vision. There are two remarkable exceptions to this view of Byzantine selfhood that date to the first half of the 20th century. And though both instances confirm some anxieties, Eurocentric, even colonialist, recurrent in the period, they are both worth examining in some detail. The 18th volume of the year 1932 of the journal Imago contains a small surprise for the Byzantinist. The journal, which Sigmund Freud started and directed from 1911 until the eve of the Second World War in 1937, hosted studies of psychoanalysis applied to historical figures of the past. Here, for example, is the beginning of the 1925 volume with an article by Freud himself on a case of the devil's neurosis in the 17th century. On the Austrian painter Christoph Heitzmann. In the 18th volume, Henri Del Medico presented a 30-page article devoted to the autobiography of a Byzantine writer, and the title reads, An Oedipal Complex in the 11th Century, Michael Psellos. Del Medico provides a close reading of Psellos' funeral oration for his mother. Here is Psellos in a 12th century miniature. A text in which Psellos constructed a hagiographical portrait of his mother, engraved with lengthy autobiographical digressions, including the description of some remarkable dreams. Del Medico acknowledges that the name of Psellos will be unrecognizable to most of the journal's readers, because, he writes, unfortunately, the entire Byzantine culture has been so much neglected. But Del Medico hopes to use, as he says, this forgotten Byzantine writer in order to turn the attention of Westerners to the East, where they might discover, and I quote, the key to certain features of the modern man's character that primitive people cannot deliver. The article is at once remarkable and disappointing. Remarkable for the willingness to look beyond the boundaries of what was considered the Western European tradition for the prehistory of modern sexual subjectivity. It is worth remembering that, for example, that the successors of this kind of enterprise were not so willing. Michel Foucault, in his celebrated Unfinished History of Sexuality, left the late antique and medieval Greek tradition entirely outside his purview, and the lack of knowledge of Greek could not be an excuse in this case. Appealing are also some of Del Medico's readings. As I noted, Psellos reports some remarkable dreams that depart from usual dream vocabulary of Byzantine writers. In one of them, he sees himself brought by angels in front of a stony barrier, which he then must pass on his own, brought through a navel, he writes, which lay open in the form of an uneven circle. Psellos, then in the dream, indeed passes through, as he says, and finds himself, so he passes through as the stony opening, he writes, yields to him like the softest flesh. And then he finds himself in a church, in front of an icon of the Virgin. Del Medico, as you might expect, reads here, perhaps not unjustifiably, a suppressed sexual desire. The momentous entrance signifies a sexual act, which, however, according to Del Medico, is immediately confronted by the prohibition. He writes, "Then comes the repression, the icon of the Mother of God." However unusual, the article is also disappointing in its circularity of argument. The Byzantine text is made to fit the demands of a universalizing discourse of the Freudian male self. Inescapably, Psellos suffers of amor patris and amor matris and timor patris, and is diagnosed with latent homosexuality that explains his enormous narcissism. Psellos is refashioned so as to fit the anxieties of the male modernist subject. In other corners of more or less contemporary German intellectual writing, Byzantine discourse of the first person singular was to find some more refined readers. In 1904, a young man of Jewish descent in his mid-20s by the name of Georg Misch, here in a photo taken about 30 years later, presented a 3-volume work to the Prussian Academy of Berlin titled The History of Autobiography. Following the footsteps of his teacher and father-in-law Wilhelm Dilthey, but also influenced by a German philosophical tradition that traced its roots back to Goethe and Burckhardt, the young Misch devoted each volume to respectively Greco-Roman antiquity, the Middle Ages, and modernity. He read closely as many texts that he could identify as autobiographical, which he used as documents for the history of the gradual and glorious process of individuation, as he called it, the humanity's most important achievement, the slow but exciting discovery of oneself. The third volume of 1904 concluded nearly at the eve of modernism, ended with an aporia. Will there be, Misch wrote, a new autobiographical art form where new forms of the creative imagination will develop? An art form, he continues, comparable to the memoirs of the late 19th century German writing where, and I quote again, we sense the creative power of the heroic man of modern times. Misch, who went on to live for another 60 years, living through both world wars and the troubling but exciting period between them, did not continue his work in search of an answer to this question. Instead, he spent almost his entire career as a university professor, then an exile intellectual in England, and then again a professor in Göttingen. Here is a photo taken late in his life. So he spent his life expanding his original 3-volume work in order to write a comprehensive and thorough history of autobiography, which included not only works of ancient Greek, Latin, and other Western European languages, but also Arabic and Byzantine Greek. The work was reissued in a revised and expanded form right after the Second World War and is now available in 8 massive volumes of 3,885 pages. Here's a photo just to give you a sense of size of just 2 of these 8 volumes. The work is monumental in every respect. No one would repeat something even close to this after him. And modern historians of autobiography are often too quick to dismiss it, all the while expressing their awe at the achievement. The dismissal derives from the fact that this history of autobiography, or rather of universal human self-consciousness, as Misch saw it, turns out to be a prehistory of gradual and glorious emergence, visualized nicely in the cover of a recent re-edition, of a very specific type of subjectivity, modern, secular, European, indeed German, and I might add, male subjectivity. Or even, we might playfully say, Misch's own subjectivity. The last chapter of the original work is devoted to his father-in-law, Tiltai. As one might expect, Byzantine writing that Misch did indeed include did not fare all that well in his teleological scheme. The Byzantines do, one must admit, a little better than, say, in Hegel's earlier account of Byzantium as a world with no greatness in thoughts, deeds, and individuals. This is a quote from Hegel's influential philosophy of history that follows a similar teleological pattern. So, in contrast to that approach, Misch does note the achievements of Byzantine writers like Synesios of Kyrene and Gregory of Nazianzos and the early Byzantine authors whom he regards as precursors to Augustine. And he also does spend 70 pages on Michael Psellos and several more pages on a few other late Byzantine authors. Yet Misch cannot but complain, for example, that Synesius does not actually reach freedom, I quote, in his self-expression. Similarly, Misch is almost surprised to discover in Gregory of Nazianzos expressions that show that he was conscious of the subjective character of his poetry. As for the later, more properly Byzantine Psellos, in Misch's account, he discovers in him a personality that is unworthy of or even stands against the humane in the humanistic tradition, classical tradition that he revives. Psellos in the account of Misch stands apart in sharp distance from the free man who desires truth and clarity, Wahrheit und Klarheit. The Byzantine autobiographical self, that is, though it must be included for the sake of scientific historicist comprehensiveness, it cannot at the same time satisfy the linear narrative of the emergence of European subjectivity. It remains an outsider. But we would be mistaken to bypass so easily the painstaking reading of the sources of Misch. His pioneering and, with all its erroneous assumptions, scrupulous examination of autobiographical texts from a variety of linguistic traditions that remained, and I believe, unfortunately, without following or influence. No other modern European writer, with the exception of Byzantinists, has spent such time and energy on considering even the possibility that a story worth telling exists regarding the Byzantine discourse in the first person singular. Compare, for example, the work of Misch with Erich Auerbach's Mimesis, the other, similarly monumental in its vision, but also in this case influence work, a work that was devoted to a universal history of the European literary tradition, from antiquity to modernity, a history of the representation of reality in literature. The similarities between the two works are striking. Auerbach, who later became professor of Romance philology here at Yale, completed, like Misch, his work in exile in Istanbul during the Second World War. And like Misch, he saw his work as a defense of the values of humanism, so meticulously shattered by the horrors of Nazism. Like Misch, too, Auerbach told, through the history of mimesis, a history of the secular, free, autonomous individual subject in European writing. And it is interesting that in the recent anniversary edition, prefaced by Edward Said, a modernist painting is chosen, Max Beckmann's Departure. Yet, unlike Misch, Auerbach spends no time to the post-classical Greek tradition. The road from Homer leads unidirectionally to Western European writing, Chrétien de Troyes, Dante, Shakespeare, a typically Western canon. By not looking at all like Misch did at the post-classical Greek tradition, however, an opportunity is perhaps missed for Auerbach, writing in Istanbul, to discuss, for example, the most comprehensive, in my view, and I do not say this lightly, theoretician of mimesis in the pre-modern philosophical tradition. I refer to Proclus, a Constantinopolitan who led the Platonic philosophical school in Athens in the mid-5th century CE, and who exerted great influence also in the West through the works of an unlikely student, another Byzantine writer, the Christian theologian known as Dionysius the Areopagite. Therefore, Misch, even just for his obsessive devotion to a universal history of autobiography, deserves admiration. It is an irony of history that he never managed to revise the 3rd volume of his original work. Of the 8 final volumes, that is, 1.5 are devoted to antiquity, 6.5 to the post-classical and medieval literatures, and only 1, the slimmest and never revised, to modernity. Misch, who began his career as a fervent advocate of modernity, the kind of modern self-confidence from which modernism almost desperately wished to flee, Misch, who experienced the unforgiving malicious side of that modernity, became in the end, almost unwittingly, a medievalist. Here you have a man who seems to remain deaf to the challenges of modernism, as well as speechless to the horrors of modernity. His desire for new forms of self-expression posed as a question in 1904 remains chillingly unanswered. The clock, for him, seems to have stopped in the early 20th century, and solace can be found only in the close readings of the distant medieval authors. Or is Misch perhaps another version of modern, indeed modernist appropriation of medieval and at that also Byzantine aesthetics? I mean that the attempt to construct a comprehensive view of human history, of the unified human self from beginning to the present, makes the Geschichte of Misch the last universal chronicle, a discursive form first cultivated to obsessive perfection by Byzantine authors and imitated in a variety of neighboring linguistic traditions, the form that lies behind both Lothar's statue of Daniel, with which I began, and its declining sequence of kingdoms, all visualized as one man, with which, and Misch's own progressive self-discovery of the European man. At this point, I would like to leave Misch and modern reception history aside and turn for the 3rd and last part of my paper to some exploratory remarks of Byzantine discursive subjectivity. It is hopefully clear that, by what I have said thus far, that I regard the notion that subjectivity is invented in this or that period of Western European history as a modern historiographical myth driven by ideological prerogatives. It is, I believe, self-evident that neither the consciousness of oneself, nor theories of self, nor a discourse and representation of subjectivity are privileges of this or that society or social group. A Byzantinist could, for instance, say, without sounding too defensive, that Byzantine philosophers, expanding on earlier traditions, developed a sophisticated theoretical language of subjectivity. The notion of personal hypostasis or personhood, for example, in Gregory of Nazianzos, Gregory of Nyssa, or Maximus the Confessor, a notion that today is discussed primarily almost only by patristic scholars and Orthodox theologians, is part of a remarkable attempt to articulate a subjectivity that accommodates both relationality and autonomy. The examples could go on. My concern, however, is to point some of the particularities of the Byzantine approaches to discursive subjectivity. I could begin with the example of the notion of hypostasis just mentioned, in order to say that Byzantine writers show some reluctance to transfer the sophisticated vocabulary they create regarding the subjectivity of divine personhood to human subjects. For human selfhood, that is, they continue to employ, though again with expansions and variations, the philosophical discourse of Plato and Aristotle, which stressed a fragmented and layered self from matter and body to the soul and mind. This disparity in approach has much to do with the fact that Byzantine writers, similarly to but more pointedly than Byzantine artists, operated with a diverse and often contradictory series of inherited vocabularies and registers of discourse, bodies of language, text, forms, and knowledge. Byzantine writers were trained to switch between these registers in almost imperceptible ways that cannot satisfy the double impulse of modern historiography to identify coherent systems of thought and linear histories of form. The Byzantine written tradition is a hybrid tradition and simultaneously a fragmented one. It is also a world where precisely tradition and the authority of convention provide the mask of innovation, originality, and why not individuality. The culture of Byzantine representation is a culture in which tradition is the tool for becoming oneself. Perhaps in the exact opposite ways to modernism, if you will allow me this irreverent statement, Byzantium is a representational culture that shouts convention while silently creating minute forms of avant-garde. The autobiographical text, the Byzantine discourse in the first person singular, is no exception to this. Within the Byzantine rhetorical tradition, the literary tradition that came to dominate Byzantine performance and book culture, we encounter authors who place themselves, their lives and emotions at the forefront of the text, primarily in two specific modes of writing that they inherited from antiquity. The speech of self-defense, Socrates' Apology provided one of the models for this, and letter writing, which Byzantines defined as the process of imprinting, mirroring, imaging, creating an icon of the writer's soul. Bound by this Greek rhetorical tradition and its unfailing conservatism, itself an impulse that infused Greek writing since its own period of colonial expansion in the 4th centuries BCE, medieval Greek writers, for instance, never create a literature of confession that in Latin and then Western European tradition found its most eloquent representative in Augustine. For Byzantines, the model of self-representational rhetoric is an author already mentioned and examined by Misch, that is Gregory of Nazianzus, here in a 12th century portrait from one of the several illuminated manuscripts that contain his works. This canonical figure of the Byzantine Christian dogma and learning happened to be also one of the most self-referential writers of the Greek tradition. A member of the rising Christian aristocracy of the late Roman world, a professional rhetor made bishop, Gregory found himself in constant need of redefinition, self-definition, in direct competition with others to whom he addressed a carefully fashioned self-portrait. Let me give you a very, very small taste of Gregory's first-person speech from his self-defense, his Apologetikos. While defending his devotion to private contemplation as opposed to public action, Gregory writes, and I quote, "Nothing seemed to me to be comparable to shutting the senses and going beyond flesh and the world, turning inside myself, living beyond the visible, and continually bearing in myself God's reflections, both being and always becoming truly a spotless mirror of God." One may talk about the philosophical notions of subjectivity upon which this mini self-portrait is predicated. The combination of being and becoming, for instance, is a bold philosophical move if set in comparison to the earlier tradition. What interests me here, however, is the aesthetics of this rhetorical self-portrait. If one looks closely, one realizes that these are not Gregory's own words. To some extent. For example, when he claims to be a spotless mirror of God, he adopts an Old Testament metaphor that interpreters of the Bible read as expressive of Christ, that spotless mirror of the Father. Simultaneously, Gregory's phrase, "shutting the senses," is lifted verbatim from an influential essay by the Neoplatonist Plotinos titled On Beauty, in which Plotinos urged his readers to avoid the deceptive simulacra offered by the senses and the dangerous self-mirroring of Narcissus, but instead to focus on the inner self. Gregory, that is, assumes the voice of biblical as well as Platonic discourse, which he now fuses and speaks in the first person singular. The text expresses the desire, which it then performs. Gregory becomes himself through the ideal models provided by tradition. The passage is typical. To speak of oneself in the Byzantine tradition was to set oneself in a hierarchical relationship in which the personal I merges with the exemplary I. To pursue it's a rhetoric which positions as well as expresses the individual self with and through the ideal models provided through normative others. There are visual counterparts, it seems to me, to this aesthetics. While we do not have, as far as I know, any Byzantine self-portraits in the narrow sense of the word of an artist who paints himself, we do have self-portraits in a more flexible sense of portraits where the represented figure was or must have been to some extent involved in the production of his or her image. I'm referring, for example, to the so-called donor portraits. Here is an early example in the medium of icon painting that drew again on earlier visual art. The viewer's gaze is first directed to the large figure in the center, a saint identified as such by an inscription bearing a halo looking directly at you. At the left corner of the panel, the painter has added another figure that also carries a name and is most likely the person who commissioned the work, the icon. This is, I would argue, the closest we get to a Byzantine visual self-portrait. Its aesthetics are similar to those of Gregory. The self is set in a hierarchical relationship to a normative as well as protective other that both subjects the self, the gesture of kneeling, the size of the figure suggest as much, as well as, however, subjectifies the small Nicholas, who in the frame of the icon is allowed to occupy an ultimately exceptional position, next to and in contact with a saint, transcending the boundaries of the human condition. The effect of Byzantine self-representational aesthetics is thus double. On the one hand, the self retreats, submits, surrenders. On the other, one discovers, creates, performs oneself in the act of submission. Let me conclude with Byzantine autobiography. The 1100 years of Byzantine writing have an intriguing series of discursive self-portraits to offer. I have only shown you a tiny brief example from the dominating voice of Gregory to display some of the limitations but also the possibilities. What I hope is clear is that none of these portraits can easily be mapped in histories that seek to identify linear narratives of progress or decline, or easily recovered in greedy, nostalgic gestures of appropriation. For Byzantine authors speak to us from behind a series of masks, in which, perhaps paradoxically, they sought a true, genuine voice with which to speak about themselves, a voice with which to express the I that speaks under the specific angle of its existence, to use the words of the poet who articulated most eloquently the end of modernity and modernism alike. Thank you.